Hi, everyone. I hope my audio is working. And if I get a thumbs up, I'll continue. Um, I'm speaking to the from the site of the forum. So I'm speaking to you from Tiohtià, which is Montreal, located on the unceded territories of the indigenous lands of the Gagné people or the Mohawk Nation, who are recognized as custodians of the lands and waters on which we're gathering. This is the day of truth and reconciliation as well. So I think in a way, it's very meaningful that our last panel discussion, um, it is about telling a fuller story and using storytelling for placekeeping. And I'm using the word placekeeping instead of placemaking because Chinatowns have been here. We're not making a place, we've been here before. And of course, we are on the lands of folks who have also been here since the beginning. So anyways, I'm really excited to dig into this topic with the panelists that we have today and how this idea of the power of storytelling, can be harnessed as a tool for placemaking and placekeeping in Chinatowns. I'll do a brief intro of our panelists. You'll be able to read a more kind of fulsome dialogue, or sorry, a more larger bio of them on the website. But first off, we have Jenn Low, who is a design director and landscape architect with Openbox, and she also works with the 1882 Foundation out of Washington, D.C. We also have with us Chow, a Chinese Canadian archivist with the Chinese Canadian Archive at the Toronto Public Library. And June was also involved as the archivist for the paper trail to the 1923 Chinese Exclusion Act exhibition. June is from both Vancouver and Toronto. We have Rick Wong of the Long Time No See Collective, a collective of intergenerational artists and educators in Toronto. You can find Rick, cycling around and teaching Kung Fu anywhere in Toronto. And of course, we also have Dee Gao with us, who is based in New York State. Dee is the Senior Director of Research and Development with the National Trust for Historic Preservation in the US. And amongst her projects is looking at new preservation initiatives for America's Chinatowns. So without further ado, I will hand the floor over to Jenn Low for her presentation.
Thanks so much, Karen, and thanks everyone for having me today. I'm really excited to be part of this session this afternoon. My name is Jenn Low. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm an integrative designer, educator, and landscape architect. I'm currently the design director at
Is there a
Openbox.
problem with my audio?
Oh, do you hear me okay? Okay, all good. As Karen mentioned, I'm currently the design director at Openbox. We're an equity-centered design, research, and planning studio based in Brooklyn, New York. I live in Washington, D.C., and I'm a first-generation Chinese American raised in the suburbs of Seattle, Washington, by immigrant parents by way of China and Hong Kong through Vancouver, British Columbia. My work sits at the intersection of participatory design and public history, and as a built environment professional and qualitative, human-centered researcher, I seek to redistribute power in our design processes to advance our work in spatial justice. Storytelling, specifically about people's lived experiences, is what grounds my work today as an avenue that can contribute to direct design action in our cities and neighborhoods. I have been an 1882 Foundation friend and collaborator across participatory mapping, oral history, and cultural heritage projects for Washington, D.C.'s Chinatown between the years of 2019 and 2021 when I met the foundation. And I partnered with them to work to make visible both past and present day places of significance to people who are connected to this neighborhood. That includes both past and present residents, longtime business owners, and community leaders. If not already familiar, the 1882 Foundation is a national cultural heritage and civil rights organization located in DC's Chinatown that promotes the public awareness and continued significance of America's 1882 Chinese exclusion laws. They do this work through programs, development of curriculums, cultural preservation projects, and community convenings such as their talk story events, to make the Chinese American story visible. So I've been asked today to answer this question: what does storytelling mean in my domain? And I'm very much leaning into the theme of today relative to storytelling, and as a designer, not using visuals, but using words to convey my answer in the work that I do today. So as a designer in the built environment, as a landscape architect and urban designer, storytelling gives me the why and not just the what, the important decisions we make to improve, build, and redevelop places that have lasting impact on the communities that live, work, play, and speak respite there. Storytelling lets me learn about the everyday places that people rely on and how those spaces fit into people's everyday lives. Not only their functions and purposes, but also where we can seek out more stories to better understand different perceptions and perspectives on neighborhood change, such as the community church or the corner store, where longtime community leaders and business owners have seen and experienced generations of neighborhood change firsthand. Storytelling lets me learn about informal gathering spaces beyond the city park, where people convene with community: the stoop, the street corner, the storefront, the mid-block alley, and how those spaces adapt, change, and evolve in different ways at different times of the year, different days of the week, to bend and flex to people's needs and the ways they come together with their own communities. And storytelling lets me better understand our neighborhood caretakers, and not just who they are, but also their systems, their networks, their resources that they cultivate to maintain and sustain the health and well-being of their communities. Storytelling is the vehicle that plays a really powerful role in place-based decisions that connect to history, to context, to the human scale details and qualities that create enduring, lasting places that communities themselves are able to steward and be part of in the long term. So I'm really excited for today's conversation, and thank you so much for the opportunity to convene with you all today. With that sentiment, I will pass it over to June.
Hi, everyone. Thumbs up that you can hear me. I think my bio should have dropped in the chat, and I do encourage you to give it a bit of a read. And I think there's a LinkedIn link so that you can see a little bit of my background. But I did want to spend my time really talking about this issue from the perspective of an archivist, which I think is a little bit off the beaten path, we'll say. I'm June Chow, and I am an archivist. I work with records, which are the building blocks of stories. Presenters who have been asked to share the stories behind why they do the work they do have all done so through images and records of their community and family, dragged and dropped onto that intimidating blank slide. Across Chinatowns, there's intense work that is underway to collect stories before they disappear by collecting original records, or by creating new records through photography or other means of recordedness. The stories we gather need to be affixed to a medium in order for them to be preserved. I am an archivist. I work with records deemed to be of value and therefore worth preserving. Which brings us to the age-old question that gets our collective blood boiling, right? Who gets to decide whose records, whose stories have value and are preserved as part of the historical record, as part of the official story of our city, for example? Well, I'm here to tell you who decides and how to become the one who decides from inside this system. Because the archival profession is a system, right? It's one of many colonial systems that continue to exclude cultural communities and perpetuate the harms of this exclusion. Throughout this forum, presenters have named these systems and their erasure of physical neighborhoods, their erasure of communities and a way of life. And this panel addresses the erasure of community histories so that they never even existed. What do we do about such systems? Well, one thing Chinese people do is study up. We become lawyers and planners and journalists and academics and artists, right? And now, I guess, archivists, to gain access into these systems, to dismantle them from the inside, to ensure inclusion, representation and equity in the policies that affect our communities. I am an archivist with access to the archival system now. Shh. And here is my blueprint for you. First, like any system, you need to know how archives work. Archival theory is based on the concept of the creator, an official body with prescribed functions through which records are created as evidence of those functions. I was trained to archive at UBC on the papers of Bernard and Jean Weber. They had careers in local politics, teaching, and historical writing. The records they created had a predetermined place in BC history, which they slid right into. In contrast, the Chinese came as laborers and were illiterate. They had no official functions and no capacity to create records to document themselves. So it's no wonder there are so few records of the Chinese in the archives. The ones we do find are scattered and exist on the margins. And this reflects that many of them were indeed salvaged and would have otherwise been discarded at the city dump. But once you know how the system works, you can game the system. You can find a workaround, right? You can set out to be your own creator. You can collect records. You don't need to be the original creator of them, but the act or function of collecting them and bringing them together in a capacity deemed official is recognized as a form of creation. And we've done this cheat for decades now, right? Records in the community are collected to create an exhibition or book and become part of an archive using the back door. Paul Yee did this with Saltwater City for Vancouver Centennial in 1986. Those records are part of his personal archives at the city. More recently, Catherine Clement did this to commemorate the Exclusion Act. Those records of Chinese immigration certificates are a research collection now at UBC. But the problem with this cheat is that it doesn't change the system. It doesn't get us justice, which is what this forum aims to do. I am an archivist, and I know we're close to systems change because I work with Chinese Canadian records that have a predetermined place in the archives and a front door to use. I can feel the systems change in the records themselves and when I speak with their donors, the individual and collective sense of representational belonging, a term coined by American archival scholar Michelle Caswell. In Toronto, the Multicultural Historical Society of Ontario has been collecting and preserving Chinese Canadian stories for almost half a century now as a nonprofit, community-based archive. Shortly before the pandemic, it was joined by the Toronto Public Library and University of Toronto libraries to do their share of this work as publicly funded institutions. And I want to make something perfectly clear here. Institutions do not wake up one morning and decide to share power. There is always community demanding accountability, saying this is important to me, this is owed to us, make it right. When we speak about the value of records, increasingly we recognize their affective impact, their value based on our emotional connection to them. Archives are emotional work. The pain and anger that is felt from being excluded from the archival record, they are exactly the emotions we need to harness to make things right. As always, we need to do this quickly. The records that have been coming to market these past few years, they were created and collected by Chinatown activists who were the first ones to do the work we're doing today in the 1970s and 80s. They are records of creating and keeping community, exactly the counter narratives that we've mentioned we need to preserve. Those records creators have started to die. They know the value of their records and they are looking for them to go somewhere. We cannot leave their records to chance. Salvaging records before they go to the dump is no way to document our community's history. It is wrong. We can do something about it, and I look forward to discussing how with fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, June. That was great. Your presentation, resonated with that, famous George Orwell quote of who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past. So I'm really looking forward to getting deeper into how archives, in a way connect also to the future of our neighborhoods. So we'll pass it now over to Rick Wong of Long Time No See Collective in Toronto.
Hello. Sorry, I got a little interruption here. I was sitting here and all the lights went out in this room. I'm in the Concordia room at the Chow Foundation. And anyway, hang on a second, I'm going to screen button here. Everything was going great.
Perfect. We see your screen.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so yeah, I spoke on the panel on the other night after Karen's film, and I was talking about showing up in Chinatown, and yeah, I've been teaching Kung Fu and cycling and stuff in Chinatown for a few years now. And I don't think adding muscle to the community is not a bad thing, but my story today is about 3 art projects that I've recently been involved with in Chinatown. So if you recall, during 2021, this is a photo from the Stop Asian Hate rally at Nathanfeld Square in Toronto, and during COVID lockdowns. At the same time, there were some business owners that were giving up, and non-Chinese developers were moving into Chinatown, and they still are assembling land in Chinatown. And this is a picture from a fighting displacement webinar that in April of that year with Friends of Chinatown. So during that time, I was talking to actually the chairman of the BIA, and he said something kind of disturbing to me. He said that the only people he thought that really mattered in Chinatown were the business owners. And it was the property owners, not business owners, property owners. It was their right to sell out and to move up the success ladder. And I started to think about, like, well, you know, whose Chinatown is this? It's kind of an ongoing theme of what we've been talking about recently. And I really started to think that Chinatown is really a special community. It's actually the people. It's a whole ecosystem of relationships, supports for families and working people and seniors, and that if it's not helped out, it's not going to survive. So my wife, Brenda Joy Lem, initiated our group a long time no see. And we asked people that if they had an emotional attachment to Chinatown, they could take a selfie, write a memo, and we made and we pasted over 200 posters around Chinatown to show the community's attachment to the neighborhood. Sandy Yep was taking notes. His son, Alex Yep, wrote kind of a nice quote. He said that, "I like Dumpling House because when I was a kid, my parents were always busy with their work, day and night, 24/7. But every time we went to Dumpling House, I always knew we were going to be together there like a family." That's Alex and Sandy on the slide there. So then after that project, we did a project which focused on the seniors of Chinatown, because I think they're the most vulnerable, but they're also kind of the most valuable asset. They're often overlooked. They're also quite often in the background. And Paul Yee wrote on his poster, "Chinatown is where you dream your Chinese-Canadian dreams. I never knew my grandfather, but heard they had come to Canada before my father. The early immigrants to Canada often posed for a studio photograph to send home to China. They dressed their best to show family members their good health and success, to allay the worries of relatives. For this photo, I imagine seeing grandfather in person, reaching to him across time and geography, between past and present, and through whatever languages we spoke. Chinatown, of course, was the most natural place for us to meet. I dreamed that we spoke adult to adult, and he smiled and told me everything I wanted to know, even made me laugh." That's our group, long time no see there. Some of the members I think are in the audience, some are online. And that was at Celebration on the group postering up at the local library. That's Chuck Kwan there with the cleaver. Anyway, earlier this month, in September 2023, we just closed down our show that we had at the Valley Art Gallery in Markham. And we wanted to make connections between the downtown and suburban Chinese communities and commemorate 100 years since the head tax, and the 1923 Exclusion Act, and what it means to belong in Canada, and how to make community in the suburbs, but also to get the suburban Chinese to understand their debt and connection to the original downtown Chinatown. And thinking about what it means to belong and the Exclusion Act, it coincided with the 100th anniversary of the Williams Treaties, where the First Nations in 1923 signed away the territories that Markham is now built on. And further adding to the narrative, when you think about belonging in the settler project called Canada, we worked with First Nations, the actual Williams Treaties First Nations, to create a meaningful land acknowledgement and to get their actual participation as far as they wanted to go in the show. The chief of the Hiawatha First Nations pointed out to me, she said, well, you know, the Exclusion Act and the Williams Treaties are actually different things, and that the Chinese were being kept out, but we never really wanted to be in there in the first place, which I thought was kind of an important distinction. In the summer, over the summer, we bused people from downtown Chinatown to Markham, and we bused people from Markham down to Chinatown to create a dialogue between the two communities. There's Qua in front of the Lungong Association on Spadina. And this is a picture, some of you may know Arlene Chan's husband, Leo Chan, at the Chan Association, talking to people from Markham on the tour, giving a tour of the Chan Association. We went to some of the associations, and the people from the suburbs were like blown away by the depth of what there actually is in Chinatown. So this is a photo from the east wing of our show. There was like the intro room and then two wings on the show. The central room of this show, though, was unofficially, we used to call it the Paper Sun Room, and it commemorated the pains of family separation caused by the Exclusion Act. This room was mostly done by Qua, whose grandfather was a headbacks player and his father was a Paper Sun. And their poems written at the Victoria Immigration Center were projected through this cage bed in the center, and they're all projected on the room, the wall you see on the right-hand side. They were immigration center detainees. In the back corner, Qua made an altar to the ancestors. Visitors could take a red envelope and write a message of thanks to the ancestors or a message to a missing loved one, and then tie it on the cage bed, which you can see on the left. You can see it's starting to fill up with images there. These are some of the images that were photographs taken in the show. This is Tristan Blackbird Martel. He has a Cree mother who's a missing and murdered Aboriginal woman, and his father's a Cambodian killing field survivor. There's a lot of trauma in this guy's life. And he does Taoist chanting now, and he combines hip hop and brass dancing all together. Chris Pui, he's a Markham resident, and he fought off a white supremacist that was hassling his mother in this Walmart parking lot out in Markham. About a month before our show, someone tried to run over some Muslims at a mosque in Markham. So like this stuff is kind of current. Author Sky Lee, she staged this tribute to the small town Chinese Canadian restaurant waitress. And then we have Elvis. Elvis is an 83-year-old Chinese Filipino. He's been doing Elvis tributes for years at family parties. And Elvis actually performed at our opening, which was really fabulous. And then here's a great photo with Elvis meeting Tristan in front of Jim Wong's Ride for Redress banner from Jim Wong's 2005 Cross Canada Ride for Head Tax Redress. So anyway, by the time the show's closing, the cage bed was completely covered with people's messages. And we had a ceremony, closing ceremony at the show. So we had, like, Popos came and helped out. It was so many people came and wanted to volunteer for the show. A lot of people said that they had never felt themselves represented at an art gallery before. This is the first time they could see themselves. It was, their stories seemed like so important. And we had a final ceremony. You can see Tristan in the back. He led a round dance for people, and Qua is burning the envelopes and sending the messages off to heaven. So for us, changing this colonial narrative of a blank land. It's like, we're here, we live here. This place is alive. Chinatown's not just real estate up for sale. We have to honor the ancestral sacrifices, show we fight back, strengthen our community connections and resources, and show Chinatown is something worth fighting for. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick. I had the opportunity to visit some of, the exhibits that A Long Time No See put together, and it's just so great. We'll get into it deeper, but how, in a way, this kind of very intangible thing of storytelling can have very real world implications and effects, like this idea of bringing community together in the spaces, expanding on the story and getting us to connect back. So these stories translate into real meaning for places that perhaps previously didn't have meaning, and real change in terms of connecting us to move forward. So now I will pass the microphone over to Dee Gao to learn about all the work that she's doing.
Great, thank you, Karen. I'm just gonna put my slides up. Can you all see that? Okay, great. All right, so last presentation on the last panel. Excited to be here and really honored to be invited to be part of this conversation. My name is Dee Gao. I work for the National Trust in the United States. I'm usually based in New York, but currently zooming in from Montreal. And it's been really fun the last few days, just connecting with everyone and getting to know the Chinatown here. So I'm going to be talking about my work on an initiative that I'm leading at the National Trust dedicated to America's Chinatowns. But I thought I would start with a quick story about what brought me to this work. And I decided to pursue a career in historic preservation, or I think heritage conservation is the more common term outside of the US. But largely because I wanted to support Chinatowns. My father had his office in Seattle's Chinatown, where I grew up. When I moved to New York and the East Coast, where I've built my life since college, I also spent time living in Manhattan's Chinatown. And when I kind of set off on this path to and decided to go into historic preservation, I was really inspired by Manhattan's Chinatown, where I was living at the time. And before I even knew that historic preservation was a field that you could go into, that was a professional field that people could build their careers around and dedicate their lives to, I knew that I was very passionate about understanding the history of the neighborhood that I was living in. And even though it wasn't my own family's history coming from the West Coast, I still felt deeply connected to it and just wanted to understand it better. Really felt every alleyway, every brick, every balcony had this story to tell. And I just felt very drawn to it, like it was a portal to a long lineage of things that have happened in the neighborhood. And I think what was part of what was so compelling about my connection to history and the neighborhood was that it wasn't just these kind of long gone stories of a dead past, but you got this sense in this neighborhood that these stories are still very much unfolding, and that while this way of life that you see in Chinatown might be long gone in other parts of New York City, it's still alive and well in Chinatown. And I just thought that that was really remarkable to have that kind of continuity. And that's when I really started noticing the power of place in nurturing social connection and a sense of belonging, and what inspired me to go into a place-based profession like preservation, which is adjacent to urban planning and all these other disciplines. One experience that left a significant imprint on me when I lived there. I lived in this building on top of Joe's Ginger, a soup dumpling restaurant. I would go to get into the apartment, you'd go through the gray door on your right. And I would, trudge up to my 4th floor walk up in this tenement building every day. And on the 1st floor, I would always pass this open door that led to a small unit that belonged to a single elderly woman neighbor. And we didn't speak the same dialect, so it was really hard to communicate with her, but she always had her door open and something amazing cooking. And her apartment just looked like a time capsule from another era. This vintage pressed tin ceiling, these old appliances, the scent of all of the cooking kind of caked into the walls over the decades. And it just felt like, it felt like something special. And one day when I was coming home from work, as I always did, I walked by the apartment, tried to get a glimpse of my neighbor, but I noticed that the apartment had been completely gutted and new drywall was going in. There were movers and there were no signs of my neighbor. And it was all just incredibly sudden and distressing. And her, I noticed a few days later, her apartment was listed for a higher rent, and, you know, started opening my eyes to other change that was taking place across the neighborhood. Foreign businesses opening up, longtime businesses kind of, you know, shortening their hours or closing their doors. The appearance of trendy bars and galleries and new hotels kind of entering the neighborhood. And it just made me question if there was something we could do about that. And what happens to a community when the tangible spaces and the places that marked their existence just quite literally get erased and disappear. And so this was really one of my, I think, early entries into trying to discover what forces are there, what tools do communities have to protect themselves against this kind of erasure, whether it's wholesale, intentional, planned, or more, I know nothing's organic, but more organic, if you will. So I remember during one of my early interviews for grad school, when I talked about my mission to kind of preserve Chinatown or to want to be involved, I was told by an advisor at a university that historic preservation is not really designed to protect places like Chinatown. The reason cited being that the Manhattan's Chinatown in particular, it's situated in these old tenement buildings. They're not architecturally significant. They were built for a different purpose at a different time to house different immigrants, and there was no way to link their significance to the present day Chinese American community that inhabits them. And I remember being so confused and disappointed by this very limiting framework of what preservation could do in terms of its policies. But I decided to continue studying it to understand it better, but ultimately started my career in real estate and economic development so I could understand these forces that are all at play a little bit better. But today, long story short, 10 years later, a global pandemic later, I'm really proud to be leading work at the National Trust for Historic Preservation that has brought me back to my roots of wanting to protect and preserve Chinatown. And to support it in the way that so many people have talked about Chinatown being as not just a relic of the past or a museum, but as a living ecosystem. So how do we do that with existing systems? I thought it would be important to kind of talk about why now. So the National Trust is the largest nonprofit dedicated to historic preservation. In the United States, it's about 70 years old. To my knowledge, this is the first time that we've ever meaningfully invested in looking at places, ethnic enclaves and places like historic Chinatowns across the country in a meaningful way. And for me, the why now was just, we've all seen the devastation from the pandemic over the last 3 years and how it intensified these pre-existing challenges in Chinatowns across the country and really exposed kind of both the resilience, but also some of the fragility of our ecosystems. And seeing how the pandemic disproportionately harmed Chinatowns really prompted me to encourage the National Trust from the inside to kind of kickstart an initiative to look at how we can support these places better. And I was really heartened by some of the support that we received before. But I also like to call out this in the question of why now and why is this so important. This journal article I came across from 1949 by Rose Hum Lee, who predicted the imminent disappearance of all Chinatowns, because they would soon be obsolete, because many of the discriminatory laws had been repealed from which Chinatowns were formed, and assuming that there is no more use for Chinatowns, and they would all be gone within a few years. But clearly history unfolded in a very different way. So the America's Chinatowns Initiative, the vision is to push the boundaries of the US preservation movement to support the cultural preservation of ethnic enclaves in a way that fits community needs. And rather than asking for all diverse communities to fit into this narrow framework that I kind of referenced earlier, of which a lot of US preservation policy is currently based on, with a heavy leaning and emphasis on architectural significance and material integrity, to kind of think broader about what it actually means to preserve a living ecosystem. And I started having conversations both formally and informally with Chinatown leaders across the country, and kind of developed a set of internal guiding principles, and to sort of set the arc of what we hope this program to do. As a national nonprofit, we are privately funded, but our sphere is the entire country. And so we, there's so many exciting initiatives and projects and groundbreaking work that's taking place in Chinatowns all over, but we're really trying to find our place in helping to amplify and support these local efforts from our position as a national entity. And we're proposing to do this work, and we've kind of started to do this work in a few major avenues. And one of them is to host convenings and roundtables and conversations, much like this amazing forum that I have the honor of being part of with Chinatowns across Canada, but to do so for the US and North America, hopefully. Just the idea of getting Chinatowns out of their own communities and talking to one another, sharing best practices, and developing this robust peer network where we can share resources and grow stronger together. Also to collect more data and research so that we can strengthen our advocacy efforts and really understand what's happening in our communities. I think Jenn Low mentioned in a panel yesterday this need for an increased digital footprint, so we know what's happening, and we all have access to these tools in Chinatown, so we can mobilize quicker, is a lot of the thinking behind that. And then lastly, this idea of increased federal advocacy, as well as not just talking the talk, but bringing in resources from different places, from foundations, from government, from others, to create a dedicated grant program and investment strategy in our nation's Chinatowns. We have a few, so we're still in the early stages of this, but we have a few successful models at the National Trust, such as our African American Cultural Heritage Program that invests millions and millions of dollars in African American neighborhoods, communities, and historic sites across the country. And I think that that could be adapted for the Chinatown network in the United States. So since we launched this initiative, we've really worked on first integrating Chinatown advocacy into all of the levers of change that we have as a nonprofit organization. So we've been conducting research. We've conducted some convenings, focus groups in different Chinatowns, and we're also exploring how we can elevate Chinatowns as a priority in our advocacy campaigns and our existing grant programs. One example of that is our Backing Historic Small Restaurants program. I think someone in the forum earlier on the first day asked about rural Chinatowns and how we foster that sense of community when there isn't a big urban community living. Our Backing Historic Small Restaurants program, because of the Chinatowns initiative this year, was able to support the oldest Chinese restaurant in the US, Pekin Noodle Parlor in Butte, Montana. This is some restoration work we've helped them fund. We've helped Cozy Inn, which is run by one of the direct descendants of the 6 Chinese survivors of the Titanic, featured in a documentary called The Six earlier, I think that came out last year or earlier this year. This is an image of their neon sign that our funding helped them to turn on for the first time in over 30 years and repair back to apparently a better condition than it was ever in the last 50 years. And then the Far East Cafe in San Francisco, California, which I believe is the oldest restaurant in San Francisco's Chinatown. So these are just some small ways that we've been able to kind of make a difference at these community anchors and hubs in rural and urban Chinatowns across the country through our existing grant programs. And that's just one example. One other advocacy initiative that we're particularly proud of is our annual list of 11 most endangered historic places in the country. This is a big media-driven campaign. There have been a lot of nuanced discussions about the power of media, but this initiative is really rooted in community participation. And I think something that just creating an America's Chinatowns initiative has done is it's led to and encouraged local communities to reach out to us when before there may not have been a strong connection. They may not have seen themselves in the work that we do at the National Trust, but it has been encouraging more Chinatowns to reach out to see what can be done together. And this is an example of that, where we this year, for the first time in 36 years, since the program's creation, that we have listed not 1, but 2 Chinatowns, Philadelphia and Seattle International District. There was something different about the campaign this year. And I have a feeling it has to do with the Chinatowns and just the accord with the public, this fight against erasure, against large-scale development projects that are demanding that communities of color like Chinatowns accept this disproportionate harm in the name of progress for all. And we really wanted to help the local communities who are fighting on the ground for this to amplify it and shine a national spotlight on these issues. And I think in the first week alone, it generated over 1,000 separate news articles across various platforms and TV, web broadcast stories, and was really able to bring some additional attention to the fights that these communities are going through on the ground. We're also piloting some smaller projects and looking at how art can be a driver of honoring places that that are seldom told, stories that are seldom told, so that they can be part of the American story, but also to honor and recognize places that may or may not exist. This is a line drawing by my friend and an artist collaborator now of the National Trust, Sammy Yuen, who we have partnered with to pursue a project along Route 66, which is a major initiative of the National Trusts, but because of the America's Chinatowns initiative, to go and seek out and research and talk to people and find Chinese American stories or AAPI stories along Route 66 across rural America that really expand the narrative and the footprint and storytelling around where Chinese people have been and contributed to our nation's heritage beyond just that we built the railroads. So this is an example, and I believe the latest is he's going to be expanding an initial series of which he produced 12 drawings into a 100-site exhibit that will be featured at the Chicago Chinese American Museum next year. And I feel like I'm really over time, but I just wanted to share some research just to about the kind of scope of Chinatowns in the United States. So we don't think this is a definitive and comprehensive list, but we did look at where Chinatowns were on a national scale. And using the criteria that we that we identified, we found about 84 Chinatowns, past and present. We found that 38 of them are still existing. However, the majority of them have kind of returned to the annals of history, but there are still relics of them. But out of these 84 Chinatowns, I think over 60 of them were created before World War II. And yet only 9 of them have been historically designated and formally recognized by the system of preservation. So I think a lot of this work is about changing our systems from the inside to understand what the barriers are and how we can continue to push our institutions to do better by these ethnic enclaves. So I'll stop there, and sorry for going over time, Karen, and look forward to discussion.
Thanks, Dee. No, it was great. I mean, I'm probably the worst moderator for timekeeping, but it was amazing, Dee, how you kind of encompass so much of our talking points and the things we want to dig into your presentation. So, you know, I'm a documentary filmmaker. In a way, storytelling is in a very literal sense, what I do, but something in this latest film that I've done, Big Fight in Little Chinatown, something that disturbed me, and it was one of the biggest takeaways for me, was how, you know, so much of the history of our communities, all in Chinatowns all over, was actively being erased. You know, like the condo building behind my head, which is right beside the Montreal Chinatown gate. These developers kind of coming into our neighborhoods, literally on all the marketing material for their luxury condo buildings, erasing the fact that the communities they're coming into are Chinatowns and have very long living and existing communities there already. But you know, like this power of kind of community storytelling to you know, to go from the kind of intangible to on like actual tangible change. You know, I realized as a documentarian, like the act of telling your story can be an act of rebellion. You know, like it's this daring to insert ourselves into the mainstream narrative, to not only have your history or the history of your neighborhood acknowledged, but also to ensure that your future is written into the future of the neighborhood. So to me, all of you, I mean, some people might be like, how did they put this panel together? Everyone is working in different fields, but storytelling in a way is a tool that we can all use in our different domains as a tool for change. So I'm kind of collapsing 2 questions into one question, but it's like, you know, for you in your fields, and a lot of you have touched upon that in your presentations, like what does storytelling mean for in the work that you're doing? And how are you kind of leveraging storytelling for that change, you know, and in the different kind of domains that you're working in? So if maybe I'll throw it back to Jen, who we started with, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great question. And I think bringing that back to leveraging storytelling as a tool, as an urban designer, and like working and trying to shape environments, like spatially and physically, it brings us back to like our humanity and our dignity in places. I think, you know, places and like the beautiful buildings that we create, like the sexy design decisions, you know, that we make, don't necessarily actually acutely identify or address like human desire, needs, the way that we convene, cultural practice, the way that we need spaces and places to work for us all to be really healthy and thriving and be able to be really connected. So storytelling becomes, like, to me, like the essential vehicle in order to be able to understand our human experience. And I do see, when you were speaking about like development and change, that erasure and that muting of stories is a really active tool into saying, you know what, no, nothing's here. We're coming into a blank slate. Like, we can move in because we haven't heard a voice. We don't know a history here. It becomes a really powerful thing to be able to say nothing's here in order to drive different agendas. I would place an example in Washington, D.C. So my work with 1882 Foundation and Ted Gong. for like different decades from the Washington Post, he would keep articles about the shrinking Chinatown in Washington, D.C. Like, I think he, like, from like the 70s through like the 2000s, there'd be these big articles that be like, shrinking Chinatown's going away. It's never going to be here anymore. And he's like, every decade I see the same article. Like, can they say something different? Can there be a different perspective, a story to tell about this place besides it just like evaporating? And I think what was really powerful working with the 1882 Foundation, like, it is a smaller Chinatown, like, no doubt, it's a few blocks. Those boundaries sort of change depending on who you talk to, but like, I found it really powerful that Ted could say, like, upstairs, you know, where this karaoke like sushi restaurant is where like the Chinese Opera Club has always performed and no one can see it. And then he can point to the convenience store where if you just go, you know, beyond its doors, it's a regular convenience stores, but there's also a place where you can buy your bok choy. You can like get your frozen dumplings too. So there's all these really smaller, finer moments about like people's experiences that storytelling can actually be visible and be a very powerful counter tool to narratives when it comes to certain agendas being trying to focus, because it becomes like an insurmountable amount of evidence of like how people live and what the values they really want to embed in a place.
Great, thank you, Jen. I was wondering if June, maybe you would want to pick up some of this, because you're literally dealing with like pieces of the past, and how does those pieces of past things that were maybe even forgotten or not recorded with the same value as other folks' history, you know, how does that inform change actually for us on the ground in the present as well?
Yeah, I think you know, there's a lot of, like, we've been talking about narrative a lot and the storytelling in other panels as well. I think this morning's panel really kind of like the media stories are the really, you know, are egregious. The developers, you know, distortion and use their own version of the story of Chinatown is so offensive. And really, you know, when we look at those as institutions, they're beholden to stakeholders or readership or, you know, things that they're not beholden to us. So, you know, their stories are designed that way. What I find a little bit more egregious is like the public archival institute, you know, our public archives, our public institutions that, you know, stay silent. They actually don't work they work from a place of like silence and apathy. And specifically municipal archives that have the mandate to record and document the history of a full and complete history of their city. And we know that the role of Chinatowns within cities is very intimate and long and complex. And yet, you know, our archives from our records from these communities just they don't end up anywhere. And I think this like you know, we have Chinatowns, you know, communities. When we do our activism, we have these, you know, relationships with city governments, and we do have relationships with academic institutions, right? And these are, you know, the way I see it is that these are public institutions that are accountable to us, and they do have archives. It's just that archives are this invisible kind of structure, right? That is not a condo or a jail in our neighborhoods. They remain hidden, and that serves them to keep things under kind of it serves that purpose. But you know, Dee was saying, why now, right? And EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, is sweeping through all our public institutions. And, you know, one way to think about the archives within, you know, municipal and universities, for example, and those partnerships that we do have, is that they're really just another department. It's like literally like city engineering that we, call 311 for services. Well, we, have needs as well when it comes to the archives, and have, that we have equal access to, or we, that is the point of the archives, is to serve everyone. So if we don't use those resources, if we don't call to account, then those budget lines, right, resources that are allocated to marginalized communities just get smaller and smaller because we don't use them. We don't know how to use them. We don't know how to call them to account. So this is really, the time to do it, I figure, is we have to name archives in the heritage reports that we, because they're a very specific type of heritage. And we need to, do the same type of studies, the same studies that we do around housing or space use. We need to know where our archives are. They're incredibly scattered. And when you say George Orwell, talks about control, right? Who controls this, controls that? We have no control. We have so little control over our records. And so we really need these like academic studies to know what we're talking about, both at the local level and then the national level, because this is a collective story as well.
Thanks, June. What you're saying resonates here so much in Montreal. We had the fight for the most historic block of our neighborhood, and a lot of the mobilizing that we were able to do in the community came from the fact that we, folks like JP, who's a kind of a museologist living in our neighborhood, uncovered so much of the history of those buildings, but us as a community also told the stories of those buildings that were very important. And, a report was done on the kind of heritage of our Chinatown. It was very interesting because it was based on a lot of the existing archives. And so when it came, the French history of the neighborhood, it was like 64 pages deep into this study. And then it comes to, the Chinese presence in the neighborhood. And it was, a couple little lines. And to find out more. And then, of course, the indigenous history of the neighborhood was like, we need to know more about this. But, the fact that those kind of reports are written in that way, it tells us whose history is preserved, whose is not, and then also who is entitled to have a future because of, the past. So I'm from the sharing circle of day one to these conversations now. Moving forward, it's so important. The history does inform the future. And Rick, for yourself, I'd love to hear from you, your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so for me, I think that when we are brought up by our parents, we're part of a certain narrative, right? Our parents tell us stories and tell us where you are in, my mom always talked about Canadians and stuff like that. And so, for some of us, the success is to actually lose those original Chinese roots and enter mainstream society. My dad used to say, you can get along with everybody, right? And I think assimilation has been kind of a goal for a lot of immigrant parents to successfully assimilate. But I think one of the things that I found when we did our project was, and you sort of take that in as a personal narrative. So there's a bunch of narratives going on, but for me, I take it back to the personal narratives of how you see yourselves within this continuum and this community. And one of the things that struck me, we did a showing of In the Shadow of Gold Mountain at Markham. And that was one of Karen's films. And after that, in the Q&A, the discussions that happened afterwards, we had some groups. All of a sudden, all these people were started talking about their family stories. They all of a sudden start to see that their individual was part of the greater common. And so, Dee, when you're talking about creating a groundswell push for the recognition of ethnic communities as being important, well, a lot of people don't really necessarily see themselves as part of that ethnic community. But all of a sudden, these kind of events like that, they all of a sudden go, oh, that family went through this, my family went through that. And then the thing with the 1923, with the Williams treaties, you start to see what was going on in 1923, that they were doing this to them, and the First Nations community, they're doing it to, there was these things going on. So you start to create allyships in those kind of ways. So I think the power of storytelling is to change the narratives that we were raised with, that, it's important to assimilate, get out of Chinatown and all that sort of stuff, and start to realize, no, I've got my roots are here. I'm understanding things by strong Chinatown. Newcomers are coming. In my picture for that, I said Chinatown is like this portal. Newcomers are coming in, but I'm also going through. I'm going through the other way. I'm going through and trying to see what my ancestors dealt with, what the community deals with, and how I'm actually connected to all these things. But I'm also hoping that the community kind of understands that it's connected, and together we're kind of stronger. So I really see the purpose of storytelling to do that, changing the dominant narrative and putting yourself into it.
That's great. Rick, I think that really speaks to, Dee, you mentioning like having as some of your goals, like this national perspective also in the Chinatown, like the fact that we're talking to each other. This thing behind me is also in your Chinatown, and the reasons for this thing being approved, are the same reasons in everybody's Chinatown. So I apologize for my moderating. So I'm looking kind of at this chat, and I'm seeing a lot of questions actually around, people being very interested, like working in the system. Folks like Dee, June, and landscape architect also kind of like spaces that you're working in, Jen. Like how it's interesting how we can look at maybe working to change these systems from within, and how do you keep sane doing that, knowing that these systems were built really to kind of exclude the type of work and places that we are trying to protect. So I don't know who would want to take that on, maybe Dee, and then we can continue.
Yeah, and I think this ties back to one of the points that Rick was just making about how a lot of these ethnic enclaves in these communities don't see their stories as valuable or worth telling. And I guess I go back to things like seeing representation, true representation, and how if you don't see it, you can't be it, because you just don't have that kind of framework in your mind. And this is where I think having these connectors, these bridges, and every Chinatown, every community has these bridges that can play that role of helping to establish these connections between the stories of the communities that have seldom been told, and how they can better integrate into our institutions and our policy to affect real change on the ground. And I think in my experience in doing this work, it is kind of it's challenging, because there is a healthy distrust of, I think, of government and institutions, particularly outside organizations like the National Trust, included in that establishment among communities of color, and that's within good reason and past experience. And so, how do you overcome that? And I think it goes back to who's at the table, who are you inviting to tell their stories, not telling people's stories for them, and just creating space in the historic preservation field to allow others to see themselves in it. And you do that by example, by leading by example. You do that by stating that this is a priority and bringing those folks in. So yeah.
Yeah. I'll follow up to that. That was great, Dee. And I was thinking about who's at the table. So like in our architecture and like planning spaces, we're connecting to developers, we're connecting to city governments, we're connecting to federal governments who are in these positions of power. And for us at Openbox, community engagement processes have been a real deterrent to being able to do the work that we want to do for placekeeping. So in our studio, we're actively trying to work against these like checkbox community engagement processes that are just about like, if you can get to a meeting at 7 p.m. on a Wednesday and say if you are for or against the project, then that is the space in which we'll get consensus. But we don't get any sort of information about that. So like for us, we actually center qualitative, like in-depth, long-form interviews. Like when we're in architecture teams, we are going and actively going to where people are at, and also being able to have conversations with folks who are the most invisible in these processes. the loudest person in the room is not going to be someone that we touch with. We're talking to the, you know, the folks who are historically marginalized from design and planning decisions, because that's where we can actually have those qualitative conversations, and where storytelling can give us that why. Like, we can learn about why, you know, certain communities are really invested in these spaces, and can really then translate those stories into futures. And I think there's also, people are often scared about that there'll be difference in what we want to create for the future. I think there is actually more commonality, and if we can actually really define what that commonality is, I think we do want to collectively to create places that like communities can thrive, but the communities themselves really need to be an active participant in those conversations, because there's only so much information like experts in these fields have in terms of knowledge and context setting to move us forward.
Thanks, Jen. No, that's great. Like, one thing that really struck me in general, with regards to policy and all, like how so many of the tools of heritage preservation like don't speak at all to the community in a way. Like we yesterday we had a tour of our Chinatown, you know, the family associations. They live in our most historic buildings because our Chinatown actually is on the original geographic footprint that it began on. So these are very old buildings. But if we have policies that help, you know, protect the facade and the fancy cornice or whatever, the people that own those buildings, the stewards of our neighborhood, you know, they can't afford to maintain those buildings or keep those buildings. And is it so important that we have like the carved wood whatever thing, and as the community and all the intangible cultural heritage happening inside it dies because they can't afford to keep the building? So, you know, like I guess the stories and understanding, like being someone like Rick on the ground, like knowing like what is actually happening in this neighborhood could inform folks who are, you know, in offices or in, you know, wherever they're at making these kind of policies. I don't know if you see also in your domains like ways in which just your presence being there or your access to very qualitative information gathering from the actual community can kind of inform change in these things that seem so kind of desperate. We always have our federal government coming down here because their only domain on our Chinatown is like heritage, you know, like let's make a museum, let's put a plaque here. Like, is that actually going to help us on the ground? Rick, I see your hand.
Yeah, there was a discussion about whether our Chinatown should have a museum, and I think Chi said, if we get a museum, we're dead, right? Like, because, you know, so that's that dual-edged sword. Like, you want to have a saved record, but at the same time, once you become a dead thing, like a thing in a glass case, then it's over, right? Like, so there's a kind of a dual-edged thing about that. When we were doing our first project, I mean, we worked with the BIA and talked to them, and, you know, managed to get some help from them. But if they didn't help us, we were just going to go post pictures all over all the walls everywhere, right? And they were like, no, we're trying to like clean up Chinatown, and that's going to look like vandalism and all that. And it's like, well, if you don't get us some sites, we're just going to post it. So at the same, you know, so while I'm glad that y'all are embedded in the system, you know, I think that's great, you know, but I think that, you know, if we don't have people embedded in, we just have to keep going. Like, we just show up in Chinatown and do work and talk to the elders. And I mean, Chinatown, like, that was a question I had about working with the community centers, because in the old days, the associations were the community centers, right? If you needed social services, you built them, you did them yourself. And that's so much stronger in one sense. I'm glad that we have social services in Chinatown, but they're, like, you know, the problem with the social service here is it's got funding and all that sort of stuff. And then they can pull the funding, they can pull strings on it and all that kind of stuff. Self-help community ventures themselves, if you can get people to work together, are so much stronger because you're self-resilient, you're self-help, right? So that's always the double-edged thing. But I think, you know, without that groundswell of people working in the community, of doing stuff, then it's great that the institutions can kind of follow and document and save artifacts and all that. But if we're not creating those things, then it's all for naught. We need the strength on the ground in the community and just get out there and do stuff.
No, I love that
I-
diversity of tactics. Go ahead, June.
Oh, yes. I would be remiss if I did not mention the anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and kind of the efforts to work to even get access to our records of this period. And this is, of course, like the Chinese Exclusion Act is kind of like the origin story, right? It's this like collective narrative that every early Chinese Canadian family and individual story can intersect with. So that's where kind of this feeder system into a larger collective narrative. And you know, the lack of like how this is like the biggest body of records that we have are actually government records, historical government records that are still under restriction at Library and Archives Canada, and which we were only able to open a little bit out of the political will out of this year's anniversary, which I don't know that we're going to have another anniversary in my lifetime to be able to, but there are more records there, and it has certainly mobilized a lot of people to reconnect and really to initiate that kind of storytelling within their own families that has been broken, that line had been broken, and is so because it's been multiple generations ago, like 100 years. And so the line of storytelling and passing them down, family histories and stories, has actually been broken, and so the rebuilding of that has been largely is still largely on these government records that are held within an institution that is impenetrable. But as a new professional in the archives profession, like, all of us have to have hope, right? That we can actually change or make a difference, even if it's like it affects just the stoop or one story or one, that we have to at least that's where I am currently. So, putting up that fight against like a condo project or a jail project, like, we just have to do it and do the work and see where it gets us. I don't think I really have a point other than saying that a lot of these records of Chinese Canadians are not under our control. They're like in government records, like the big kind of treasure trove of Chinese immigration records in Canada and the US. And then also that they are in repositories, right? They are scattered all over the place in repositories for the most random reasons. Like, you'll sit around and somebody told me, hey, did you know in Montreal there's like this random Cantonese opera LP set that's like at wherever and wherever from the 1930s. And it's just, again, the randomness of it all, because there is no strategy around how we document our community's history and in these types of institutions, and how that impacts us ultimately from exclusion.
Thanks, June. I mean, I just yesterday, we opened Chinatown House. We have a lot of pop-up exhibits. There's one on the paper trail, but the folks came in, archives and that storytelling piece, because our things have been scattered and unvalorized. It brought community together. Simon Wing, the son of James Wing, who was one of the head taxpayers that led our fight for redress, came in and scanned certificates from the Chinese Presbyterian Church that was expropriated when they built Guy Favreau. There was Mary Chapman here has and her with UBC, they've done these amazing histories on the the newest or the oldest Chinese residents in our Chinatown, and descendants of those families were here yesterday, reconnecting this idea of building the community back. And when the place has a history and a meaning, people do fight for it. And you can mobilize the community just from the simple act of being able to be part of that story. So I'm seeing we have probably about 5 to 7 minutes left. I'm not sure if I was wondering if you would like to add some of that, like with the American Chinatowns and also this being in that kind of domain of historic preservation, but, looking at history to kind of, in a way, preserve things into the future, but in a living community kind of way.
Yeah, there's so many threads here. It's hard to know which one to pick up on because they're all so fascinating. But I mean, I think to the question of, there are people who are working within systems for change, but we all function and play a critical role in creating change for the future of our communities. Like there, as a national organization, for instance, it is not our place to come into any local community and say, you need this, or this is the building you need to preserve. That comes from the grassroots movement of the community, and that kind of interaction of having people within and outside to push the boundaries is, I think, critical, and just for creating the change that we need to see. And I think it's also important to remember, I guess, the roots of the preservation movement itself. It started as a grassroots form of activism for communities to band together to fight outside interests that were trying to make decisions about their communities, places that they cared about, to take away their space, to fight for, their cultural touchstones. It started as a grassroots effort. It became institutionalized and professionalized as a field. And then you have all these kind of convoluted structures and laws and regulations that benefit some communities more than others, to put it generously. I think that is, it's calcified, this kind of structure of laws and regulations that have excluded places like Chinatown from being able to benefit. Like the places that, Canada has, it seems, with Vancouver's early designation, Montreal's recent designation, it seems like you all are leveraging these tools in kind of fresh ways, but it's like we also have to recognize the limitations of that. But it's never meant to be kind of the end all be all silver bullet of what's going to save our communities. It requires all of us working together in tandem, like heritage policy, working explicitly with anti-displacement strategies, working explicitly with the zoning, working explicitly with the private sector and the nonprofit sector to fill in gaps where policy is falling short is a huge component of that. And so it's like kind of like turning a big ship with a bunch of tiny paddles, trying to change these systems. But I think one of the things I enjoy about working for the nonprofit sector is and not being reliant on federal funding entirely is that we can be a bit more nimble and we can experiment and focus on things that we can change in the meantime while we work for longer term wholesale impact. I think I saw a comment in the chat about how do we protect our peace, like working in these institutions that seem like they'll never change. And I think, for me, a huge part of it is just focusing on the impact, however incremental, that we can create every day. And connecting to the communities and the sites and the places that we are making change in, even if it's a micro grant, or if it's technical assistance, or if it's just getting them a ton of media coverage, and while working towards the longer term goal.
Great, thanks, Dee. I think it's so important, like going back to the very first panel, which was entitled, Chinatown is not a museum, right? Like the work we're doing to preserve the history is not to preserve it under glass or to mothball it, but really to preserve the living part of the community. And these kind of changes by keeping these histories, preserving the buildings, I guess the ultimate goal would be to preserve the intangible cultural heritage happening inside of those buildings. And it's the community that keeps those places alive. Like we have historic buildings of our Wings Noodle block where everything has been knocked down except for the one historic block. And what over policy and everything, what kept that block alive were the people and the activities and the things that continue to take place in those buildings, but have historically been taking place, for centuries. So we're about to wrap up. I don't know if there's a last comment before we're kind of wrap everything in a nice tight bow to move into our Super Saturday workshops.
I'll add one thing that I've sort of learned as like a designer going into storytelling spaces and trying to collect more stories is also like the additional investment of time and capacity to understand in what ways we can allow more people to be able to feel comfortable and vulnerable enough to tell their story. I think it's one thing to be like, yeah, we let people say what they want to say, but I think some people will be more inclined and comfortable to tell their story. And because of, generations of harm about providing information and telling your experience, we don't have great conditions in which we can set the table. So I have been entering a space in which we tend to like slow down a little bit and to understand what it means to create those conditions for people to be able to tell their story in a way that they can contribute. So that's something I'm also thinking about, the implementation, the mechanism of storytelling too.
Yes, Rick?
Yeah, for me, the ultimate storyteller. Yesterday we had a tour with JP, who's a tour guide who lives in the building adjacent to the Wings Noodle Factory. And he talked for 2 hours about the building and his connection to the community. And through that, I mean, I think he was really he's the generator. He got that whole thing going to save that building. And to see the building through his eyes, through the stories that he told for 2 hours was incredible. And one of the Noodle Factory people came out and he said, I can tell you a story for 2 hours. He said, I've been here for 40 years. And it was like, yeah, the depth there, but the stories have actually turned into actual change in that they got the garden designated as a site that no one's allowed to dig in, which stopped the developer putting in a tower in there. They've got heritage designation on the building. So from the stories that he could tell about the building, it got heritage designation, and it stabilized both a workplace, an active workplace, but a place where people live, a place that's so super dense. There's all kinds of things that are going on every floor of the adjacent buildings. And so, yeah, storytelling was the catalyst for all of that. The stories that he could tell. They had 3 stories of artifacts on the top of of one of the buildings that they're cataloging right now, but they don't have money. He doesn't know what's going to happen. He insists that it be available for the community when those artifacts become available. But just the treasure trove of that, which all would have gone in the dumpster if not for his foresight to be able to tell stories about it and understand the importance of this stuff. So the storytelling can turn into something which really stabilizes the community.
Thanks, Rick, and thank you all for participating in this panel. There's so many more stories to come of this, and I hope it's the beginning of more collaborations between all of us. So I've been asked to wrap up a little bit and reflect on, all the discussions that have been happening. I think it is fitting, as I mentioned at the beginning, we started this conference with a sharing circle, with Indigenous folks who are both part of our Chinatown, be it from PAC, but also, part of obviously the land that the Chinatown is on top of. So I'm really excited by the idea that we're trying to tell more fulsome stories, trying to include more fulsome histories, really to inform our futures. And I think, by writing in the story of the Gagnaga folks into the history of our Chinatown and the land of our Chinatown as we move forward to reimagine our Chinatown, I think it will set us on, a different angling than perhaps the efforts of saving Chinatown in the past. So I'm really excited about that. And this is the last. I'm the worst person to be like wrapping up because I have the most verbiage happening. But I wanted to thank. We have a team of volunteers and people who have been working so hard to put this whole Chinatown Reimagined Forum together. It's the second one that happened. The first one was out of BC. So of course there's a whole team of folks online, with the UBC Instruct helping us for the online forum, informing us for the second version of the forum itself. So thank you everyone at UBC Instruct. you know, as we're closing our online portion of our panels here in Montreal, actually, we're leveraging all of your amazing insight, everybody on this panel and all the panels to come, you know, for on the ground activities here in Montreal. So the Chinatown Roundtable here are holding a Super Saturday workshops right in the Chinatown House space, where we're going to kind of look into some of these concepts and how they can apply like in a very tangible, literal way within our Chinatown. So that's really exciting. And of course, you know, it's Mid-Autumn Festival, so we'll be closing out the forum with a kind of, you know, a celebration outside in our Sun Yat-sen Square, just, you know, across the street from Chinatown House. So we encourage everyone to come out. There's going to be outdoor mahjong, drag performances, DJ performances, you know, while we kind of celebrate the fact that we are in community together, fighting for a community that's so meaningful for all of us. And of course, the proceedings of this whole program will be online, available online to everyone. I used all those videos from Chinatown Reimagined #1 that are online in so much of the work that I do, organizing and talking with people. And so all the content of this forum will be placed online with the Chow website. Please stay tuned. And, you know, I cannot thank folks. It warms my heart so much to be in community with all of you, both virtually and here at Chinatown House in person. So thank you, and hope to see you either virtually or right here in Chinatown House. Take care, everyone.